Chicago White Sox GM Chris Getz recently did a lengthy interview, and as I kept listening, I got this weird feeling, hope, and I'll discuss why on today's episode of Locked On White Sox.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, a lifelong Sox fan and the site expert of SouthsideShowdown.com, part of the Fansided Network. And also, I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. And also follow or subscribe to the show at wherever you get your podcasts. Well, Chris Getz sat down with Ryan McGuffey and David Kaplan of the Recap podcast, and a lot was discussed. And during it, I kept getting this just weird, awkward feeling, and it was hope. So I'll discuss why I felt that way in the first segment, along with then the three standards Getz should be held to during this rebuild. Then Getz talked about the brief extension talks the teams had with former Sox ace Garrett Crochet. And lo and behold, Crochet is now talking about possibly signing an extension with the Red Sox that I want to tackle in the second segment. And then finally, I'm not going to do a minor league Monday since I talked a lot of prospects on Friday. Instead, Omar Narvaez is being given a shot to return to the South Side. Let's discuss what his minor league signing means. And from big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Win or lose, visit FanDuel.com to get started. So for the first time, I actually came away impressed with Chris Getz. After his interview with longtime Sox reporter Ryan McGuffey and ESPN 1000's David Kaplan on the Recap podcast, I highly recommend checking out that Recap White Sox podcast interview. After you're done listening with me, it's on YouTube. I believe it's under @Recap if you want to subscribe to that. Otherwise, you can also subscribe to the podcast. It's an excellent podcast. Like I just said, always make me your first listen, but I would definitely put the Recap podcast, the Recap White Sox podcast on your list, because Ryan McGuffey, he's been a longtime White Sox reporter. Guy shoots straight when it comes to the White Sox. I mean, there's no BS around him. He's very blunt, very to the point. And then David Kaplan kind of hitched on for this episode, as normally it's with Brian Anderson. But there was a lot discussed, especially in the first 20 minutes of the interview, that, that awkward feeling of hope kept in. Because with Chris Getz, you want to be like, wait a minute, you got the job in the most lazy, probably the worst GM search ever known to man. And here I am feeling like there's hope. Because so far, I would say his job his job performance is trending towards what we've all expected. I would really say that. I think he's done some promising things, but he's also done some really bad things, like put together a roster that only won 41 games and even being miffed to be like, oh, I thought we were going to lose 100 games, even though, remember, he was hired to turn things around quickly, but I didn't think we would lose 121 games. And as I keep saying, the Eric Fetty, Michael Kopech trade was an absolute disaster and an abomination, in my opinion. Yes, I'm going to go that, hot takey on that one. But on the flip side, the Dylan Cease deal is promising. The Garrett Crochet deal, that trade, very promising. And signing Eric Fetty just in the first place, that was one of the best free agent signings in last year's offseason. So, I would put it as mixed reviews. But still, that skepticism, that, being apathetic towards the franchise about how he got the job is warranted. So it's kind of always been hard to have that hope, especially like in the offseason of, going into 2024 when he said, I don't like our team, completely, in that comment, absolving himself of how the team decayed and rotted, his responsibility in that as the director of player development. But when I was listening to the interview, he was sounding confident, first of all. And a lot of times I don't think public speaking has been his best. I don't think that's his strong suit. I think when he wanted to say, I don't like our team, I think he meant to say, like, I just don't like how it was constructed in the first place, on that. He did come across as sounding like someone who knows what he's doing, or at least, what he came across as? Someone who's going to go get some adults in the room. That's where I got some hope. Although then I got frustrated for a moment. And then I was like, you know what? I'm going to formulate these three standards that I'm going to hold Chris Getz to from here on out. This is how I'm going to evaluate how Chris Getz is doing his job, because like it or not, we're stuck with him. You and I are stuck with him. He's not going anywhere. The only way I actually see him getting fired, and I see these comments, for example, in like the Southside Showdown Facebook page, where they're like, "Oh, just fire him." It's not happening. The only way he gets fired is, honestly, I think if the White Sox win 36 games. And the Zips projection is looking, there's a possibility that could happen. I'm going to talk about that during the week, but we're stuck with him. So I want to discuss again why I came across with some hope, why I got frustrated, and then what are the 3 standards that you should hold Chris Getz to during this rebuild. First, he was asked, what is the plan? Straight out, Ryan McGuffey said, what's the plan? I think it's about 15 minutes in. He obviously didn't give a step-by-step plan because no GM's going to do that. Everybody's going to talk in GM speak, and I think he's starting to match that. But to me, the plan is let's get some adults in the room, just like every other modern front office has. Let's get some analytical thinking people, some people that observe baseball and where it's going and what it's doing. He mentioned Brian Bannister a lot. Like, what's the plan? Brian Bannister. And in a lot of ways, you could say, well, why are you putting faith into the special advisor of pitching? Well, that's just his title. He is the head of pitching for the Chicago White Sox. And he even addressed Ethan Katz's stats. You got to go about status. You got to go about an hour in. But, he was saying how Bannister pays attention to trends, and he's helping the team stay ahead when it comes to pitching trends. And again, he's got a very simple philosophy. Construct pitches that these pitchers can throw well, and then throw those pitches a lot. There's a novel concept. How he said, we got a new, the Sox have a new head of international scouting. They're going to be building a new academy. They've got a new manager. And then they brought in Ryan Fuller from Baltimore to be the director of hitting, and then kind of the updates that they've done to their analytics. And I love how he did even say, like, there's the opinion out there that, do the White Sox even have a computer? And is it like on modem or dial-up? Are they still using AOL? So it sounds like he's restructured all those things. So that's where I got some hope that finally the White Sox are going to operate like a modern franchise should. And that actually will go a long way in the long run. Now, in the short term, we're going to have to suffer through another 100-loss season. We might have to suffer through 2 100-loss seasons. The White Sox could easily threaten not only the 1962, they've already broken the 1962 Mets record, but the Mets from 62 to 65 had a terrible record. They had, I believe, 400 some odd losses. They could threaten to break that type of stretch. But it made sense because he was able to put together this committee to put together an actual plan so that he could take it to Jerry Reinsdorf and tell Jerry, this is what's going wrong. This is what we got to fix. And he was finally able to get Jerry to buy in. So that's where I got hope. Even though he said now is not the time to spend. But where I got frustrated was, here's Chris Getz basically saying, he puts together this employee committee to get recommended changes. And I thought, okay, makes sense. He knows the building. He knows the people that, and he even said it's not, it wasn't even non-front office people. There were some business people that he got involved. Like, he kind of knew the lay of the land, and he was like, okay, who could I get? And plus, he brought in this guy from Harvard, I remember, or the former Marine, but he was like, who could I bring? He kind of had the idea of how 35th and Shields operates, that who could he get to make these recommended changes, then to get Jerry's buy-in. And that's where I got frustrated, because I was sort of like, well, why didn't Jerry just say that in the first place? Not, I'm hiring Chris Getz because he's going to turn things around quickly. You should have just promoted him with the intention of, you understand that everything is wrong with this franchise. That the way that Jerry was meddling, that he was meddling, was going to make this, that put this team from on the path to a competitive window to basically finishing with 100 losses in 2023. That you really needed someone that sounds, to me, one of the jump to conclusions I'm going to make, it sounds like Getz was never on board with what Rick Hahn and Kenny Williams were doing. And rightfully so. And I don't think he was really on board with what Jerry was doing. So he was like, you hire him because he kind of understands who to put on this committee. He, understands, like, who should I reach out to? Who should I go find? Like, just common sense things. Basically, he's doing the easy part. And it made sense then. Why don't you just have him in, because he can hit the ground running. He can get all these changes implemented within a year to 18 months, because sadly, even though, Jerry was like, well, I want to turn things around quickly, look at how loyal he is. I'm sure Chris Getz was probably like our director of international scouting before. isn't getting the job done. How would Chris know? And I'm not trying to defend Chris. I'm just trying to show the logic of why I was getting frustrated was Chris would know because he was the director of player development. He was getting these players from international and from the draft and being like, what the, I'm sure he had to have been like, what are you giving me? And again, that's how he came across in this interview. But then I was like, you know what? We've been here before. I'm frustrated. I don't want to be frustrated. So what do we do going forward? And I'm going to suggest 3 standards that you should have to evaluate Chris Getz through this rebuild. And I wrote about it on Southside Showdown too. So the first one, the next 3 draft classes, and I do think it's the next 3 draft classes and international free agent signings, infuse talent into the farm system to keep it highly regarded. Because right now it's going to be highly regarded. You got 6 prospects in the top 100, but 3 of them came via trades. Kyle Teal, Braden Montgomery, Edgar Caro. And they're eventually going to graduate from prospect status. We saw that during the last rebuild. Remember, the White Sox in the last rebuild had a very highly regarded prospect system for a little bit. You know, you had Yohan Moncada, who was considered the top prospect, according to some sites, at least number 2, according to most sites. You had Michael Kopech, you had Lucas Giolito, you had Eloy Jimenez, you had Luis Robert Jr. You had these core pieces that were considered top 100 prospects, but guess what? They eventually graduate, and guess what they didn't have? They didn't have enough drafts and international free agent signings to back them up to keep the farm system strong. So that's why I even say 3, 4. Heck, as long as he's around, you want to continue to draft well and sign an international free agency well. And of course, and if that's the plan, if part of the plan is we're going to draft well and we're going to sign well in international free agency, then that's how you should be looking at it. And one way you can track it in data points, because obviously these guys are not all going to hit. There's going to be injuries. There's going to be underperformance. But you want to look at, are they continually infusing talent into the system? I would like to see them, again, draft high floor guys. And if you want to go safe, if you want to at least make sure your first round pick is good, that at least gets to the major league level, draft more guys like Noah Schultz, Hagen Smith, and even Colson Montgomery. I never want to see a Nick Madrigal draft ever again. And I don't care if you're a Madrigal bro. Nick Madrigal was a low floor player. Great bat to ball skills. He runs the bases terribly. He couldn't play defense. He was not going to be the next Nelly Fox. I'm sorry, folks. You know, same thing with Andrew Vaughn. Wasted. Yeah, Golden Spikes winner. But he was a first baseman. Don't use your first round pick on a first baseman. And you could say Jack Caglione, we could have had him with his power. Great. But that's more of like, you take a first baseman if they're like a genetic freak like Frank Thomas, or again, they just have great genes like Prince Fielder. Otherwise, you can get a first baseman in international free agent signing for like a 10 grand signing bonus. That's the hill I'm going to die on, folks. But these next drafts must produce not only core pieces, but, you know, depth in the farm system to make trades to put the team over the top. And, you know, international free agency, also a great way to find core players too. So that's what you should be looking at. All right. Standard number 2, the core of the team from 2027 to 2033 comes from players the club drafted or signed in international free agency. Okay, so if you're going to be out here touting Brian Bannister and Ryan Fuller, if you're going to tout those two as part of the plan, you know, the development, then I want to see developed players that the Sox drafted or signed an international free agency making up that core, because it means the development is working. And yes, Brian Bannister, he's developed pitchers in Boston and San Francisco, and he's helped already develop pitchers for the White Sox. Garrett Crochet is a feather in his cap because we didn't know that he was going to become an ace, okay? And Eric Fetty, you know, yes, Ethan Katz worked with him, but so did Brian Bannister. And it makes sense to invest in player development since the owner's not going to cut checks to cover for misses in the draft, because that didn't happen during the last competitive window. And heck, the owner's still not going to pay the going rate for premium talent, which is over $100 million. So development is big. So yes, I want to see when, you know, I know McGuffey was saying in the interview that, you know, 2027 might be the earliest. You know, I've seen MLB.com, which I'm going to talk about this week. I keep pushing it, but I am going to talk about it. That they could win the World Series by 2033. Okay, so during that window, I want to see, like, for example, the rotation is headlined by Noah Schultz and Hagen Smith. And then you also have Jonathan Cannon and Drew Thorpe, kind of being a great pitching staff, and even Davis Martin being your fifth starter. And you have Jairo Iriarte and Kai Bush and Mason Adams. You've got a lot of arms. Grant Taylor. I want to see the pitching staff basically is it mostly consisted of these pitchers you've homegrown, but also on the other end, develop hitting, because that's the biggest thing. It was the hitting that's been proven quite difficult for this team to develop. They just don't develop hitters. So you want to see Colson Montgomery flourish. Braden Montgomery was not technically drafted by the White Sox, but he didn't play a single minor league game for the Red Sox. So he's going to be a guy that they're going to have to develop. Edgar Caro becoming great would also be a sign for development, because while he did start out with the Los Angeles Angels system, the Sox did put him through the majority of his key development year, which was last year at AA and AAA. So you want to see this team being built through the draft and international free agent signings. Then I want to see how Getz spends the limited money he will be authorized. Can he spend it better than Rick Hahn and Kenny Williams? Because say what you want about Jerry's frugalness, and we're going to talk a lot about it this week, but he has authorized payrolls that have reached $200 million. You have to give him that credit. The problem was it's never been enough. He won't spend enough. He just keeps putting on these self-imposed salary caps. And that's one of the reasons why this team has decayed to its current state. So what I want to see is Chris Getz spend whenever the limited money is authorized, and we don't know when it's going to be authorized. Obviously, I'm very worried about the CHSN problem, because I could see Jerry using that as a crutch for forever until he gets his new stadium. But if he does authorize it, I want to make sure that, we're not spending, Getz is not spending a ton of money on setup men. That was a huge, huge problem for the White Sox in the last rebuild. Too much money was spent on setup men. You want to spend on a closer? Fine. It's fine. You either got to find a closer out of nowhere or you sign one. That's fine. But no more Kendall Gravemans. Don't spend too much money on Yasmani Grandal, for example. That was a terrible signing for a catcher who could not catch. He couldn't catch. Terrible in the clubhouse, too. Ruined a lot of the chemistry, reportedly, in 2022 and 2023. Gave way too much money to Dallas Keuchel. Too many years. Nothing wrong with giving him in 2020, but it should have been like a 1 year and an option. But spend the money more wisely. Hahn spent the money on Andrew Benintendi, a left fielder who doesn't hit for power. So you can see where the money was poorly spent. So let's see if Chris Getz can stand out from his predecessors by when he's allowed to spend more than just $2 to $10 million on a player. Can he spend it effectively? So those are the three standards. Well, Getz did discuss Crochet's camp wanting an extension. If he was traded before last year's in-season trade deadline, along with if the White Sox ever approached him for an extension. He did discuss that in the interview. And why this matters is Crochet just discussed this weekend that he's leaning toward wanting to stay long-term with his new team. So let's discuss once again another great player being traded because of finances and the receiving team likely having no trouble paying up. And we'll discuss that next on Locked On White Sox. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. And I always keep telling you, the money lines, over-unders, and spreads, they're fun to play. But if you want to win big, FanDuel's parlays, props, and futures are the way to go. A popular parlay for tonight's Minnesota and Los Angeles playoff game is Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, and Aaron Jones all scoring an anytime touchdown. It's at plus 1530 and $10 on that. And if it hits, that's going to pay out $153.08. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. And if you can't catch the show on YouTube, Locked On White Sox is available on all major podcast platforms, so make sure to follow or subscribe on places such as Apple or Spotify. Either way, get your 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me. Well, Chris Getz did acknowledge the White Sox approached Crochet with an extension. And, during the season, the talks didn't go far, as Bob Nightingale reported back in July. Basically admitted, yep, we approached him with an extension and wasn't going to happen. He did not mention specific years or money that Crochet's camp wanted, but during the segment with McGuffey and Kaplan, he did mention the pitching market being very high right now, and he stated Max Fried money, of where the pitching market's going. So just going to go on my jump to conclusions, Matt. It sounds like Crochet probably wanted more than $100 million, which Getz said in the interview he might finally give out a contract to someday, but it sounds like that was a non-starter. I have a feeling they called and said, okay, what's it going to take to extend Crochet? They threw out a dollar amount, and Chris was like, thank you, I cannot go that far, ever. So comes down to, again, an owner not being willing to spend the necessary money to keep stars the team actually drafts and develops. And the other thing is, Getz did touch on how he found out about Crochet's camp demanding an extension from whatever team was, he might get traded to before the deadline. That was that whole, hubbub about, Crochet wanted an extension if he was going to get traded at the trade deadline to whatever team acquired him for him to pitch in the postseason. And that did show, though, how Getz is still inexperienced, as he should have not been caught off guard. And he said he was caught off guard. He found out about it on the team's road trip in Texas. Okay, that series happened a week before the trade deadline. So that story gets leaked out, and he is completely caught off guard. I mean, come on. You should have had a meeting with Crochet and his agent in early July. Maybe he did. But you have multiple meetings then to say, okay, are there any conditions? Are there going to be any stipulations, because you're on this pitch count, that if I trade you, that you're going to put on the opposing team? Is there going to be anything that I need to know? You really got to build on that. GMs, the good GMs are not surprised by these things. And he was. But make sure you check every single box before trading away an all-star. And again, that's where I felt some frustration listening to that interview. And, there was no acknowledgement of him trying to one more time to extend Crochet, because he said at the end of the season he was going to maybe try one more time. That didn't sound like that was the case. It sounded like they had their mind made up. They're trading Garrett Crochet. And I get it. It stinks. As I've said many times, the bats in their system, there's just not enough of them, that they had to trade Garrett Crochet to get 3 bats, basically. 2 that can be impactful, 1 that can be a solid everyday player, or at least a super sub. They had to do that. But why am I frustrated too? Well, guess what? Garrett Crochet has already said about Boston, he's considering staying long-term. He spoke to the media at Fenway Fest, and according to NESN.com, quote, "Staying in Boston long-term is something that has a lot of merit in my mind," Crochet told reporters at Fenway Fest Saturday. "It's something that I think would be awesome. In the meantime, focused on spring and getting ready for the upcoming season, trying to stay focused one day at a time. There have been conversations with my agent, just getting a feel for one another. As of this moment, that's what I'm doing, is worrying about on-field stuff, and I'm going to continue to do that throughout the season. I'm happy to just stay in my own lane. That's why players have agents," end quote. In MassLives.com, Chris Cotillo, he did tweet out that the Red Sox are prioritizing locking up the young left-hander. One team hears that, Crochet wants, probably what type of money the agent says, and that team says not even close. Another team, like the Boston Red Sox, once again, hear the money and are like, well, I think we can make that work. We're going to try to make it work. So White Sox. Just goes to show you that while needing to maximize Crochet as a trade asset was necessary to get more impact bats, because again, the organization doesn't have many of them in the farm system before, the reason why he was moved was it came down to finances. It always comes down to finances with this organization. That's why, again, came down to finances, because the timeline was not going to match up. The team wasn't going to come close to what he wanted. He was going to be a free agent in 2027. And that's the earliest we might be even able to consider the White Sox being competitive. That's why he's got to go. And again, Getz said he might circle back for an extension, and it just didn't happen. Never happened. And look, okay, maybe at the time in July, Crochet's camp did say 200 million. And at that time in July, if they said 200 million, yeah, that's too much. That is. He had just made his first All-Star team. He was literally going to be put on a pitch limit where he was only going to be throwing 4 innings the rest of the year. You're not paying that guy 200 million. You're just not. Tyler Glasnow deal, though, if he said Tyler Glasnow money, I think you have to consider that because of what he was able to produce and, showing that promise. And as you saw as the season went on, yeah, he didn't have the greatest August, but still feeling strong. And the fact that you could have paired him up with Noah Schultz and Hagen Smith. I mean, the potential for 3 dominant lefties in the rotation, 2 of them coming super cheap, you have to consider that. And they didn't. So again, you and I are going to have to watch Crochet probably continue to be the dude in Boston beyond 2027. And how many times have we had to say that? How many times have you and I seen this? How many times have you and I have said it should have been in Chicago? Chris Sale, Dylan Cease, now Crochet. It just continues to get frustrating that, we're going to have to look at Crochet probably flourishing. And it does make sense for Boston wanting to extend him because that's the only way they're ever going to have a chance to win or tie this trade. Because if he leaves in 2027, after the 2027 season, and Boston has no championship to show for it, or not even playoff appearances to show for it, they will have to be deemed the loser in this deal. Because the Sox winning or tying the deal is pretty easy. Kyle Teal and Brady Montgomery avoid being Yohan Moncada. They produce consistently at the big leagues. And they definitely are impactful players. Even if they're just everyday players, 2F4, that's still pretty solid return. Chase Mydroth, if he's a consistently good big league player too, bonus. And if Winkelman Gonzalez helps the bullpen, all the better. So it's easier for the Sox to come away as the winner or tied. Boston has to extend him. They have to keep him around long term, or otherwise they're coming out looking terrible in this trade. Well, no minor league Monday report today, as I spoke extensively about the Sox farm system this past Friday with Elijah Evans of Future Sox and Just Baseball. But the Sox did make a minor move, and that is bringing back catcher Omar Narvaez. Let's discuss why it's not a big deal that the White Sox signed another catcher next on Locked On White Sox. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode. Recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, to subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox or wherever they get their podcasts, as this show is available on all major podcast platforms. Hope you had a great weekend. Hope you enjoyed hate watching the Packers. If you're if you're a Bears fan or non-Packers fan, hope you enjoyed that. I know I did, although I'm getting tired of hate watching the Packers in the playoffs. I'd like to see the Bears in the playoffs a little bit more. That would be nice. I was talking to my wife, since we started dating a decade ago and then getting married, the Bears have been in the playoffs twice and they haven't won. Wow, I think the Packers have been in the playoffs all but like 2 seasons. So I'm always going over to my in-laws and watching the Packers in the playoffs and just hate watching the Packers. So, would be nice, but I hope you had a great weekend. So GM Chris Getz was not kidding when he said catching is gold, and the Sox signed another catcher this offseason. That makes the running total to 3 catchers that Getz has acquired. Matt Thaiss, he's projected to be the backup catcher. They got him in a trade. If he's projected to be the backup catcher, if the prospect catcher the Sox got in the Garrett Crochet trade, Kyle Teal, is not ready for the show, and also Thaiss would be the backup catcher if the other hotshot prospect at catcher, Edgar Caro, is not ready for the Bigs. And now add old friend Omar Narvaez to the list of catchers coming in to spring training. The Sox announced on Friday that they signed him to a minor league deal with an invite to camp. Makes sense actually to bring him in, despite having likely no shot. I mean, Omar really has no shot at making the big league club, but it's good to bring him in because it's a heck of a backup plan. Or it's not a heck, it's a decent backup plan. Plus, he's familiar with right field, as Narvaez is an old friend of the franchise. He started his big league career with the Sox. If you remember, he played from 2016 to 2018. batted 274, 12 homers, and 54 RBIs in 221 games with the Sox. Then he gets traded to Seattle in 2018 for right-hander Alex Colomé. Spends a year in Seattle. I think it was a year in Seattle, if I read it right. Or 2 years in Seattle. I know he was in Seattle for a little bit. Yeah, I think it was 2 years. Either way, spent some time in Seattle. Goes to Milwaukee, where he works with Walker McKinven, the Sox new bench coach. And there you probably see why Narvaez is back with the White Sox. Because he can help out Walker in spring training tutor Caro and Teal. Kind of have that veteran presence who has actually worked with the catching guru. It does also provide a backup plan just in case you end up with the perfect storm of a Max Stassi-like injury and the perfect storm. And then, this being the perfect storm, Teal and Caro, they struggle in spring training and they need more time in the minors. So this provides you some cover in case Theis or Corey Lee have an injury in spring training and it's just clear that Teal and Caro need to go back to the minors. You at least then have a professional big league catcher, because that's the only way I see Narvaez staying with the team even beyond spring training. I mean, he could go to Charlotte if he elects to, because you got to remember, a lot of these minor league deals, they have opt-outs. You can sign a guy to a minor league deal with an invite to camp, but it's not like, oh, he didn't make the team, he's going to Charlotte, or he's going, wherever. It's usually, if they don't make the team, they either get straight out cut, or they, have opt-outs where they can elect free agency, or they'll go to the minors for a month, and then if they're not on the big league roster, they can opt for free agency. So, I don't see, I don't see that happening, and especially Theis has to make the team because he's out of options. So if Theis gets beat out by Teal and Caro, maybe you also have a backup plan in case he says, no, I'm not going to Charlotte, because he would have to be DFA'd off the roster. And, Narvaez, sorry about that. I butcher names. I admit it, and I'm trying. Maybe he goes there instead of Theis, because you would think if, Caro and Teal beat out, Matt, and he gets DFA'd off the roster, if he accepts an assignment, you think they're going to go with him and then have like Adam Hackenberg, because I believe they always have him on the roster. That would be your catching duo in AAA rather than Narvaez. But you never know. It's just a depth signing. Obviously someone familiar with McKinven's coaching, and he is a catching guru. Narvaez's career year at the plate happened in Seattle when he had a 278, 354, 460 slash line, along with 22 home runs in 132 games. Another great deal by Rick Hahn. But remember, Colomé, he was also solid for the Sox. His best F4, though, came in 2022 with the 2.8 with the Brewers. And that's also when his framing went from bad to great once he joined Milwaukee. He was a minus 13 as a framer. And maybe it was actually 2021 was his F4 season. I may have wrote that down wrong. My apologies. Either way, his best F4 season came in Milwaukee. But he was a minus 13 as a framer, according to Baseball Savant in 2018. 2021, his rating was 10. So he jumped a huge amount of points there. And it goes to show you Walker McKinven is a catcher whisperer. He wasn't on, Narvaez was an automatic out, though, at the plate for the New York Mets in 2024. 151, 191, 185 slash line in 28 games. He's still, though, 32 years old. So this might not be Martin Maldonado if he makes the roster. But again, it's not a terrible backup plan. Again, if you have Corey Lee and Theis getting an injury and it's Teal and Caro still just being like, whoa, they need to go to AAA. And if they need to go to AAA, don't worry. You still got plenty of time in their development. You'd like to hope, though, that those two actually make the big league roster. You can rotate Teal in the, other places. He's more, he's versatile. You could also DH Caro to get him some at-bats. So, on that. And remember, Max Stassi, he was supposed to be the backup catcher. And if you forgot that he was even on the roster, it was because he had that injury in spring training that he was out the entire year. So it cannot hurt to have a decent backup plan. Once again, another prudent signing by Chris Getz. I'm feeling hopeful. It's weird, I know. Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On MLB. Baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you're listening to your podcast. And I'll be back tomorrow to discuss who will make up this team's core with Beef Loaf from the 108.com. I'm also hoping to get Scott Merkin on this week from MLB.com. He's the MLB.com White Sox beat reporter. We're working on trying to finalize when he can come on the show. Plus, I do plan on tackling the Sox being projected to win the World Series by 2033, according to MLB.com. I keep pushing it, but other stuff keeps coming up. But I'm trying to tackle it this week. I'm also going to find some time to discuss the terrible ZIP projections for the Sox season. Not saying ZIPS is terrible. You know what Fangraphs projects, especially ZIPS. They use a lot of good data. They use a lot of, things that make sense, but they are just projecting the White Sox to have a terrible, terrible season. Feel free to leave comments about today's discussion regarding the standards you and I should have for Chris Getz going forward. Garrett Crochet likely getting an extension in Boston, and Omar Narvaez coming back to the White Sox. You can leave them at the episode page on YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, at ToddJDub or at LockedOnSox, or you can email me at LockedOnWhiteSox.com. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.